This Raw Green episode is brought to you by Obi, a sustainability consultancy firm specialized in life cycle assessment and decarbonization strategies. For more information, check oneobi.com or visit our page on social media. Links in the description. I am Francesco Delieto. I am passionate about sustainability and green techs. Welcome to a new episode of Raw Green. Would you still be a vegetarian if you knew that the meat you're about to eat has been produced without causing any harm to an animal? Or, if you're conscious about the environment, would you eat a burger with a fraction of the environmental impacts? Cultivated meat is not far from reaching supermarket shelves. If we were talking about solid state batteries or the next Tesla, we might say it is the conventional 5 years away. But given the recent FDA approval, it's much shorter than that. Is it safe? How much is it going to cost? Are the environmental impacts really so much lower compared to farmed meat? And more importantly, when can I have a California maki made with lab grown salmon? To answer all these questions, especially the one on when I can have a California maki, we have an expert who is on the front line of the development of lab grown meat, Dr. Elliot Swartz from the Good Food Institute. Elliot, welcome to Raw Green. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And why don't we start with you giving us a little bit of a story about the Good Food Institute, what the Institute does, and what you do inside the Institute.
Sure. Yeah. So the Good Food Institute, otherwise known as GFI, is an international network of nonprofit organizations that is working to really develop a more sustainable and just food system. And we are focused on what we call alternative protein technologies as ways to basically be able to uh, swap in to consumer diets without having to make a behavioral shift. And so these alternative protein technologies include plant-based meats, which is taking plant-based ingredients and trying to mimic or biomimic actual meat products. Then there's fermentation-derived foods, so using microbes as factories to create animal proteins, or just taking the whole protein biomass from something like a fungi. And then finally, there's cultivated meat, which is growing animal cells without the need for animal slaughter. And so GFI is sort of programmatically, we work across science and technology. And so we fund research. We try to figure out what are the sort of technical and economic bottlenecks that are facing these industries. And we try to sort of get people to work on those problems so that they're not bottlenecks 5 or 10 years in the future. We also have a corporate engagement team where we sort of, educate larger corporate entities, investor community, et cetera, to educate them on these new technologies so that they're equipped in their decision making. And then finally, we have a policy team that is really fundamentally focused on getting more public investment into the research and development of these technologies, as well as the sort of infrastructure build out that would be needed in the future to really scale these technologies, especially on a fast time scale in line with countries making climate goals and things like that. As far as my own work at GFI, so I'm trained as a stem cell biologist. So I spent a lot of time in graduate school growing human stem cells to study muscular diseases. And so I learned about the idea of cultivated meat about halfway through my graduate studies back in 2015. And I was just very captivated by the idea that you could basically apply what we were doing in biomedical research and stem cell biology to the food system to address challenges with animal agriculture in particular. And so I was just sort of, really found a way to meld what I was good at scientifically with what I cared for, and was passionate about, which was more, climate change, animal welfare, those sorts of things. And I've been at GFI now for the past 6 years, really explicitly focused on cultivated meat technology, trying to understand, where it is today, what needs to be done to get it to, actually integrating into our food system in a meaningful way in the future. And so I think a lot about, those technical and economic challenges that are facing the industry, and what are the sort of order of operations in which those challenges need to be addressed. And who needs to be working on those challenges as well.
What is at the moment the biggest challenge, the biggest bottleneck that you're facing?
So I think from the get go, what was interesting about cultivated meat is that it's not like some other far out technologies, like let's say fusion, right? That is sort of always in the future. We can't really do it on Earth in a sort of energy positive way until, I guess, maybe recently demonstrated. But cultivated meat, fundamentally, we can take a stem cell and we can turn it into muscle and fat and connective tissue. We've actually been doing that for decades. And so it was really more, it's not a biology problem, it was more of an engineering problem. And so the problem from the get-go was really, how are we going to scale this up, and how are we going to make it affordable for consumers in the food system? Because if you've ever done research with cells in a lab, you know that this sort of cell culture media, the feed that those cells consume, can cost hundreds of dollars just for a single liter of media. So the question is always, how do we lower the cost, and then how do we scale it up? Because we've never grown animal cells at basically scales that would be
Industrial scale. Yeah.
commodity scales for food.
And in terms of, let's say, when the product can be available for retail consumption, I was reading some news that there are a couple of companies that they are ready. They got the FDA approval for chicken, lab-grown chicken, but it would be used by professionals. It means like restaurants. They are starting to use it anytime soon. How long will it take before it will hit the shelves of the supermarket? Before, in the intro, I was joking it will take the conventional 5 years, which is actually the time frame that any new tech that is about to go to market usually disclose. Say, okay, we're going to be ready in 5 years. But in this case, I sense it is going to be much shorter than that. Is there a date or a period?
Yeah, so obviously it's hard to always answer these questions with confidence, but just to situate folks that may not be familiar. So basically this industry was spawned back in 2013 when a Dutch professor, his name was Mark Post, he basically debuted on live television for the first time a cultivated meat burger and had people taste it on TV, and that sort of launched and sort of catapulted this into the scientific reality rather than the science fiction. And so several companies were founded in 2015, 2016. And now some of those companies, as you've mentioned, have begun to be granted regulatory approval for their products in the United States, in Singapore, and there's also one approval in Israel as well. And several other countries have under review cultivated meat products. Those include South Korea, the UK, Switzerland, and I might be forgetting some others. But nevertheless, yes, basically the production scale right now for these companies is very small. It's sort of what you would call more along the lines of pilot scale production,
Mhm.
where you can produce enough product to basically service a couple of restaurants, as a menu item or maybe multiple menu items on a couple of restaurants in these sort of first facilities that have been built. And in what there's a couple of larger scale facilities, or let's say growing the operational capacity within existing facilities right now that would enable you to go from, let's say, kilograms of product to hundreds or thousands of kilograms of product, and then eventually tens of thousands of kilos of product. Um, but that is still probably 2-3 years away from really getting to that sort of scale of production within larger facilities. And so I think the general strategy for these companies right now is similar to the approach that Impossible Foods took when they first entered the marketplace, which is to sort of partner with high profile chefs and restaurants,
Hmm.
to sort of introduce these at more of a luxury market,
David
to get
Chang,
people to
if I
sort of,
remember well.
talk about it,
Mm.
get people to talk about it, to taste it, to get it into the culture. And, because it is a high priced product right now, that's sort of the marketplace that it can fit into. You can start generating revenue, get consumer feedback, etc. And so similar to like, even the approach with Tesla, starting with the Roadster and working their way down that cost curve into a more consumer friendly
Yeah.
model. That's sort of the similar approach that we anticipate for cultivated meat companies as well.
Well, okay, and in this, let's say, still young because it is barely 10 years that this industry started. What I wanted to ask you, it is conventional meat producer, farm meat producers. How are they reacting to this? Are they reactive in a cooperative manner by investing into what could be potentially they're hedging their bets? Okay, so investing into lab grown meats, or are they trying to stop the development of lab grown meat around the world? I'm curious to know what you think about this.
Yeah, so I think, right now we are tracking, all these sorts of activities, across the industry. And basically every large scale conventional meat producer is invested in alternative proteins in one way or the other, with many of them also invested in cultivated meat as well. So that means, maybe they have a venture arm of their company that has invested dollars into individual companies, or in some cases they've actually acquired cultivated meat companies. So JBS, for instance, bought a sort of majority stake in a company that's based in Spain called Biotech Foods. And then others are, partnered in other ways as sort of strategic partners, that sort of thing. And so we've seen actually a lot of buy-in from the conventional meat industry. As you mentioned, they don't want to become the next Kodak and see, a new technology basically wipe them off of the planet and out of business. And, the CEOs of these companies, many of them have said that they view themselves as protein suppliers, and if you can supply protein in a different way than the conventional meat system, in a way that's more efficient, and more sustainable, then so be it. And I think they would sort of jump at that opportunity. And so yes, they are indeed dipping their toes in it, learning about the technology for sure. I think some companies will go into it faster and deeper than others, and others will take a more cautious approach. But nevertheless, yeah, a lot of people are looking at that. And you mentioned, we've seen around the world that some countries or states in the United States are taking a sort of negative stance against cultivated meat, so actually trying to push back against the development of this technology. But I mean, what was interesting is that the North American Meat Institute, which is made up of these conventional meat suppliers, actually wrote a letter to the Florida Senate and politicians there, against the ban of cultivated meat. And they said that
Oh,
this is
really?
not American, this is against consumer choice, this will backfire, etc. And so, yeah, it wasn't actually the conventional meat suppliers that are pushing these. They're sort of more interested in the technology rather than antagonistic.
It's much less talk though about fish. What's the status there in terms of development? If you want to compare fish and beef or chicken or pork, where is the at what stage? Sorry, the fish, lab grown fish is currently.
Yeah, so just for people in the audience that aren't familiar, I mean, essentially what we're doing here is taking cells from an animal and we're feeding them nutrients and growing them as you would sort of like a brewery system where you're growing these in a large tank under controlled conditions. And so that means you can take, different cell types from different animals and different species and create different food products. And that includes seafood. It also includes things like milk, um, as well as other, organ derived meats, foie gras, etc. So you can get the whole sort of panoply of options with this sort of approach, which is great. And as you mentioned, there are many companies that are working on seafood. Seafood is more challenging because there's a whole range of species that we consume. First of all, so literally hundreds, maybe I think maybe even thousands of different fish and crustacean species that we consume as a human population. So that makes it difficult to sort of grow each individual one of those species up. Should we be doing that, etc. Most companies have focused on the ones that are most heavily consumed, salmon, tuna, these sorts of things, but also things that might be threatened, in terms of their populations. So, unagi, which is eel, which is consumed a lot in Asia, that's a threatened species, and so some of the companies are focused on creating eel for those reasons. It also can't be farmed conventionally, and so some of these, um, species that we consume uh, can't be farmed, or at least we haven't figured out a way to do that yet. And so, cultivated seafood as an approach offers a sort of alternative to meet that demand. Now, you mentioned what's challenging about seafood is that there's not really a whole lot of research that had been done previously on growing fish cells in culture. As with animal cells like pigs and cows and stuff like that, they're very similar to growing human and mouse cells, which are used a lot in research. And so you have this whole sort of body and foundation of knowledge on which to build from. Seafood was entirely different. So a lot of those companies and researchers in academia have to start from scratch and really figure things out. And so, in general, seafood is a little bit further behind in terms of its development compared to sort of mammalian or avian species like chicken.
And how far are we from cost parity in terms of let's say per kilo of meat? When can I expect to pay the same amount between lab grown and farmed meat?
Yeah, so just let's talk about maybe the drivers of what actually drives the cost of this technology. So essentially, you have two major buckets of costs that you really have to start to think about and address if you want to move down that cost curve. The first bucket is the what we call the cell culture media, so the feed that these cells consume. And so those are the amino acids, the glucose, vitamins, etc., that go into that. We There's been a lot of progress, and as I mentioned before, sort of at the top of the recording, is that if you are doing biomedical research, you might be paying hundreds of dollars a liter for a single liter of cell culture media. We have a lot of, I think, reliable data points to suggest that those costs have dropped already between, 99 to 99.5%. And so you can
Wow.
now obtain media costs that are well below $1 per liter. And that has to do with how you source the ingredients, basically moving away from what we call pharmaceutical grade ingredients into a more food grade system. That's really a major way that you go about that, as well as replacing, coming up with creative ways to replace some of the more expensive components in the media. So there's been a lot of progress there, which is great. The other big sort of bucket of cost is the infrastructure itself. And so none of there's no real existing infrastructure that you can use. You can maybe think about retrofitting, a vaccine facility or something like that. But
But there aren't that
in
many.
general,
Yeah.
those things
Yeah.
aren't stranded assets because you're making higher margins with pharmaceutical products. And so the infrastructure needs to be new, or what we call greenfield. And it's expensive. The equipment that's in there, the bioreactor that you're using, this vessel that you grow these cells in, again, comes from the pharmaceutical industry, although we use similar vessels in, food production, dairy, brewing, etc. And so we have to make it look more like brewing than it does in a pharmaceutical plant. And so all of those things, I think, are sort of being figured out as we speak. And as these facilities are being built now. Now, to answer your question directly, I mean, it's hard to know really what the cost is right now because individual companies are at different stages. I would say, if I were to guess, some of the leading companies could produce cultivated meat below $100 per kilogram today. But approaching what we would call commodity costs, $5, $8 per kilo, $10 per kilo. I think that's still not really obtainable right now.
Mm.
Now, the approach that a lot of companies are taking with respect to cost reduction for their final products is similar to what we've seen with the electric vehicle industry. So when when electric vehicles came onto the marketplace, battery costs were very high. They were sort of prohibitive. And so you reduce the battery size and have a hybrid car, essentially. And that's the same approach that we're using for cultivated meat products as well. So basically, being able to dilute the cost by using plant-based ingredients and using those animal cells as ingredients in what we call hybrid products. And so actually, one of the products that's on the market right now in Singapore is available in retail. And so consumers now in Singapore can actually go to a sort of local butchery
Hmm.
and pick up a cultivated meat product, but it's only 3% cultivated animal cells. So it's a very sort of diluted cost hybrid product. So I think it's interesting that gives, consumers the first chance to actually go home and cook and work with this product for the first time. But I think a lot of the future hybrid products will probably be at a higher inclusion rate. So you'll see something that's maybe a 50-50 blend or 30-70 or something like that will be probably more commonplace.
Makes sense. Makes sense. You need those first mover to be able to start to kick off demand, definitely. And then, like you said, you start with the Tesla Roadster, and then you work your way to the Model 3, not the other way around. Talking about
Yes.
consumer, I want to link something with that, which is labeling. Now, I find that labeling on conventional meat products, it is extremely poor. There is nothing onto labeling on conventional products. While on the other side, if you look at labels for alternative proteins, okay, you find that it looks like a list of items that comes out from Dante's Inferno. It is it is extremely lengthy with sometimes unpronounceable names. It is very complicated. Uh, how it is going to be, what it is going to be, sorry, what is going to be the label for cultivated meat, for lab grown meat? What's going to be written on top of that?
Yeah, so I think this is something that's been an ongoing, let's say, point of discussion since the inception of this, idea. Is what do we call it? So in general, a label has to accurately describe to the consumer, a consumer that's unfamiliar with the product, essentially what it is. And it also, should be appealing to the consumer as well. And so over time, it's sort of evolved the nomenclature. GFI actually started to call it clean meat back in 2016, 2017, and that was a nod to basically saying to clean energy and saying like this is a cleaner way to make meat because it's in a controlled environment, so the products are essentially aseptic or sterile when they exit, so you should have decreased foodborne illness. It should be cleaner from a sort of sustainability perspective, etc. And it's cleaner because there's no animal slaughter. But that sort of implied that the conventional meat system was dirty, and so a lot of people push back against that as a way to call it. And so a lot of consumer research has been done. And essentially where it's landed is that cultivated meat as a terminology is very is it sort of ranks more on the appeal scale. So when people read that, they think oh, this is maybe something that I want to eat. It analogizes well to essentially being able to say we cultivate plants, we feed them. You take a plant, you feed them nutrients, you create a crop, a final product. And similar, you take an animal cell, you feed it nutrients, you cultivate it, and then you sort of can make it into a product. Cultured is another sort of common term, as well as then the qualifier cell. So you can say cell cultured or cell cultivated meat. But the important thing is that you really have to call this meat because it comes from an animal, and consumers need to know that. And if you have an allergy to a shrimp, or something like that, and you're eating cultivated shrimp, well, you're going to be allergic to that product as well. And so consumers need to know that from a recognition standpoint. However, it's been that is the main point at which a lot of the let's say antagonists try to push back is on the labeling side. And so there's been rules passed actually in the United States as well as in other countries that basically you have to call it lab grown, which is a really negative term, and an inaccurate term actually, because these are made in USDA inspected facilities just as conventional meat is produced as well. And so yeah, there's a back and forth right now on labeling. In the United States, at least, the USDA is supposed to give guidance on labeling actually later, within this calendar year, sort of, final guidance, taking in all the information that they've obtained thus far. And so it will be interesting to see where that lands in the United States as well as in other countries. But right now, cultivated or cell cultured seem to be common qualifiers that we think would appear on labels, because you want to distinguish itself from actual conventional meat as well. Of course, you want to do that, and actually, you want to use that as a selling point for the consumer. And I think that's how companies view their product as a better product if you're looking at things side by side in a supermarket. And so you do want that to be indicated on the label, and labeling laws in general are structured in a way that you're not supposed to be hiding what the product actually is, which is a big concern. Is like, oh, is this just going to appear in my restaurant or at McDonald's without me knowing it, and I'm just going to eat this cultured meat without having a choice? And the answer to that is no. That's like not a real concern, because we do have labeling laws for a reason.
Well, but if you dig into the, let's say, the details, would you be required, would companies be required also to disclose, for example, the breed where they're taking the cells from, the growing medium, or any other, let's call it, ingredient that participated into the production of the culture meat? Would this be a requirement that you think is going to be put onto labels? Because it should happen the same also for farm beef, to be honest, farm meat. Anyway, you should know how much antibiotics that cow has had, how many kilos of liters of antibiotics. If we're talking about liters now, I don't know exactly. But to give that level of transparency that consumers need in order to make the best choice possible for their diets. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's basically, the labels, from an ingredient perspective, are really what's in the final product. And so when you're feeding those cells throughout the course of the production process, most of those nutrients get consumed and become basically the nutrition of the final product. And so, these formulations are generally held as trade secrets, although some of them are
Mm,
openly patented, and then you can sort of see that. But in general, you wouldn't have the exact formulation and concentration of ingredients that are being used or fed to those cells in on an ingredient label, unless that ingredient exists in a concentration that's deemed meaningful from a nutritional or safety standpoint, essentially. Now, with that said, it shouldn't really be that. That's I know that might sound scary, but when you think about what these cells are consuming, it's really basic nutrients. It's glucose, it's amino acids, it's vitamins, it's salts, etc. And so those things need to be tailored to the nutritional demands of each cell type, and that sort of takes a while to figure out, which is why it's important intellectual property for these companies to not just go out and share openly. But with that said, from a transparency perspective, cultivated meat, there's a lot to like about it. You hear companies a lot talk about basically having their facilities behind glass windows, and so that people can actually come to those facilities and see exactly how the sausage is being made, so to speak. Whereas in the conventional meat industry, obviously everything's kept behind closed doors. We do not want to see that if you're the average person, and they
you
go
don't want
to
to go
great
to a
lengths to hide
slaughterhouse.
that.
Yeah.
No, you do not want to go to a slaughterhouse for sure. And we were talking about seafood before, but there's a lot of opaqueness in those supply chains. When you're on open waters, there's a lot of illegal fishing. There's even slavery at sea. All of these sort of issues, and you're with cultivated meat and seafood. You're starting with a single cell from an animal that's documented. It's traceable from the start to the finish, and so you can really have confidence in this is the animal where you are consuming, literally down to the individual animal. And actually that animal can still be alive and
Yeah.
used as like a mascot, and you can actually go and meet that animal that you're literally eating from, which has been sort of demonstrated in the past
Yeah.
already. But that is the level of transparency that's actually sort of required from a regulatory perspective to know where this animal, where those cells came from, what was the health of the animal, that sort of thing. So all of that's known, and that's, I think, goes a long way for transparency purposes for consumers.
Yeah, I find it fascinating the level of transparency that you can have on cultivated meat, something that you will never, never, ever have on farm meat, especially regarding the part which is probably the primary cause of vegetarianism, which is the slaughtering of the animal. You will never have that available onto farm meat. Interesting to think what would be the regulation when we're getting closer to date onto the labeling part. I understand why it is a hot conversation. It is a hot topic at regulatory level, commercial level, any association level. I understand that because upon that decision, the commercial strategy is going to be built up. So that will make the
Mm-hmm.
good or the bad weather of part of the good or the bad weather of the industry. So it is a pivotal decision, a pivotal moment to take. I was interesting before recording this episode. I came across a couple of very interesting videos about some doctors that they find themselves carnivores. Nothing against it. I was just say compelled watching what was their message out against cultivated meat. And
Mm-hmm.
one of their selling point was that it is science fiction. It is something that there are risks for human health, more specifically carcinogenic risks. let's say, connected to the fact that you use a highly reproductive stem cell that, if not properly and carefully handled, it can trigger that tumor that can be reproduced really quickly. Now, as you can hear from my wording, I am absolutely no expert in medical terminology. However, the concept was, if you're not careful, you can do harm by producing this kind of meat. How safe it is?
Yeah, so I spent probably a year and a half, 2 years, pretty deep in the food safety area for cultivated meat. I participated in a week-long meeting held by the FAO and the World Health Organization in Singapore. That was a roundtable meeting that resulted in a pretty lengthy report on food safety aspects of cultivated meat, and where we basically consider all of these questions that you mentioned that a lot of people bring up. Um, but just to back up, food safety. When you think about, like, essentially, nothing about cultivated meat is novel from a way that you address it or look at it from a food safety perspective, because food safety essentially starts with, the first step is identifying what could potentially cause harm to consumers. And then you have basically a list of potential hazards. This is not unique to cultivated meat. There's potential hazards in any food production system. And then you have to say, well, how do we mitigate those hazards so that they don't become harmful to the end consumer? And then, is it possible to implement these mitigation strategies, or do you need to come up with new ways of how we think about food, production, et cetera? Like, how are we going to address that? And the answer is, like, essentially, we have enough experience from, let's say, culturing yogurt and culturing other food products, as well as handling meat products, that we have the strategies in place on how to deal with potential hazards that may arise in cultivated meat production. And so there's really nothing novel from a safety perspective that you have to do with cultivated meat. There's a lot of existing strategies, et cetera, to ensure the safety of these products. And so, because most of these products are considered novel from a regulatory perspective, which just means that they haven't been consumed in the population, at a significant level within the past 25 or 50 years. That's generally like the way that it's looked at from a regulatory perspective. That means that it has to, each of these individual products that come onto the marketplace are evaluated individually, and they are evaluated quite rigorously by the agencies in charge, for good reason, because you don't want to introduce a product that's going to cause harm to someone for eating it. I mean, that's the last thing you want to have happen. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the novelty in the food being introduced doesn't mean that there's novelty in the way that we evaluate and ensure safety of the food. And so regulators already have looked at and approved, as we mentioned before, several of these products. So that's the FDA, the Singapore Food Agency, the Israeli Food Authority, as well as other regulatory agencies are evaluating this right now. They've deemed that these products are safe to consume, and that is not taken lightly. These are really rigorous evaluations, and so essentially what you're eating as a consumer, the end product is for all intents and purposes, animal meat. And that's sort of the conclusion of the FDA in their statements, and all of these statements are publicly filed, at least on the FDA side, and so you can read a lot about what was looked at, how the evaluation was done, etc. Now, to answer your question on proliferative cells and whether that's problematic or not, I actually have a long Twitter thread on this if people are interested. But essentially, in that FAO document, as well as the FDA addresses this in their things, and basically there's basically, you could come up with the argument that even if you were eating cancer, there's no pathway to harm for the consumer. you're digesting these cells, etc. The cells are dead when you're eating them. There's no actual reason for them to actually like cause cancer or an issue in your body. That's even if they were cancer. But the more important part is that they're not cancerous cells. Cancerous cells have a ton of different attributes that qualify them as cancer. So being a proliferative cell is just one of those attributes. And so people that take a negative stance on cultivated meat or want to basically bring scare tactics into the conversation, just say, well, look, this cell proliferates fast like cancer, and therefore it is cancer. But of course, that's not biologically, anywhere near correct.
Okay, so look, Elliot, there I think that communication has to be at a level of clarity that has never been seen before, because knowledge on let's say the amount of foods that are actually carcinogenic, it is pretty much zero. People doesn't even know what acrylamide is. You know what is acrylamide? Is that black substance that you see when you deep fry stuff in certain amount, in certain
Mm-hmm.
variety of oils. Okay, that it is very carcinogenic. And in terms of safety, there isn't just the production part, there is also the distribution part, where basically you know that we do life cycle assessments. And one time on a study, we were evaluating the different transportation, downstream transportation method until retail point. And if you move a chill good from field until retail point, it can have from 18 to 26 change of temperatures across the various steps, which is massive, massive. It is massive. If you move towards a frozen product transported via sea freight, in that case, you can have 4 to 6 exchanges of temperature of the product from, let's say, slaughtering until all the way to the shelves of a supermarket. That is massive in terms of food safety. Bacteria start to grow at what, 22 degrees, 24 degrees, and they start to reproduce themselves on top of the item. So that also needs to be communicated. People doesn't know that, and they love to base their assumption and knowledge on hearsay or on who's the best communicator at this thing, and they get confused, obviously, by that. But I get it. It is a new thing. It has still some question marks, but not on how the product it is done, but how can we make it more accessible, and how we can pump up literally production, and the way that regulatory bodies around the world are going to react to this thing, are going to be also heavily influenced by the local market, by the culture over there. I mean, I am Italian, and I know the Italian government, it is totally against cultivated
Mm-hmm.
meat, because mostly because of a cultural thing. There isn't a big meat industry as there is in the States, in Italy, at all. We actually eat a fraction of the meat that other countries eat around the world, like Americans, Australians, or Hong Kong. Hong Kong is one of the
Mm-hmm.
highest meat consumption per capita in the world. So but nonetheless, and that is a cultural thing, rather than scientific. But everything you said, I like it, and I like also the communication part. As I mentioned before, it is fundamental. It is absolutely fundamental. We haven't touched much what we actually do, the environmental part. There isn't that vast amount of land use onto cultivated meat, if not just for the part that you need to produce the medium, the growth medium, and the other, let's say, growth culture that you need to grow the cells into it. There is,
Mm-hmm.
though, a massive energy requirement, massive. And is it because of the bioreactors? Is it because of a particular process that requires so much energy? If you can please clear that.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's been a couple of life cycle assessments that have been done to date, and importantly, these are all basically forward looking. So basically, taking what we know today and saying this is how we think it's going to be done in the future. So there's always that caveat that these are sort of forward looking for an industry that's in development. But nevertheless, as you mentioned, there's some general themes that have been found, which is that land use is, dramatically decreased, anywhere between maybe 60, 90%, depending on whether you're comparing to chicken or beef. And then you also have less or fewer nitrogen related emissions, and that means you have less eutrophication. So, basically marine or freshwater eutrophication, runoff essentially from manure or fertilizer that's used in conventional ag. You don't really run into that issue as much with cultivated meat. Air pollution would be significantly decreased as well. Um, and then water use is, generally it really depends, but it could be about equal to pork or chicken production, but it's really sensitive on how you consider recycling or reusing the water in these facilities. Now, with respect to energy use, generally speaking, you find that energy use would be lower than beef production, which is usually the worst across environmental indicators, but it could be higher than chicken or pork production. And that has to do with, as you mentioned, the bioreactors. And so essentially you're electrifying meat production with cultivated meat. And you have to run these bioreactors if you're growing animal cells, generally at 37 degrees Celsius, maybe even 38 degrees Celsius. With seafood cells, it's lower. You can actually grow them at their temperatures, 20 degrees Celsius, et cetera, that they're used to in the water. So that's potentially a lower energy input. But in our particular study, so I was co-authored a life cycle assessment that was published last year. And actually, we took a very conservative approach and said that, when you grow cells in a bioreactor, there's metabolic heat that's produced. So just as in your body, when you're, basically creating energy, a lot of that's lost and expressed as heat. And therefore, when you get these bioreactors really going at scale, that you would actually have to cool them down actively.
Mm.
And so that would require a lot of energy, actually the cooling of the bioreactor. Now, that is an assumption that we made in our study to take a conservative approach and basically look at maybe a worst case scenario for energy use. If you talk to experts, as I've done since we've published the study, they say, look, we don't think that that's going to be a reality at all, that you would have to really be cooling these bioreactors down. And so that, could cut the energy costs, at least in our study, by like 70%, actually. So I think in the long run, it will be interesting to see where the energy, demand works out. But I think certainly it's not going to be super, super low. But I think the good thing is that a lot of these emissions are scope 1 and 2 emissions. So they're basically, at the facility, at the production site itself, which means you have a lot of control as a
Yeah, it's
manufacturer
manageable.
to
Mm.
reduce those emissions basically by, installing renewable energy capacity yourself, putting solar panels on the facility, or, locating in a region or a grid that's becoming greener. And so you can, basically cut your carbon footprint by 70% if you switch from like a conventional average grid today to a renewable grid in the future, because most of those emissions are CO2 emissions, scope 1 and 2. And so that makes it easy to control and mitigate reduce the carbon footprint. And what's nice, of course, is that this technology is in development as we're going through an energy transition. And so similar to electric vehicles, when you plug in today, you may be pulling from, an energy grid that, has some coal in it or natural gas or whatever. But in the future, that will be lower and lower and lower. And so it's same thing with cultivated meat. That's really the advantage of, quote unquote, electrifying meat production.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, Elliot, thank you very much for participating in this episode. You've been very clear on all the topics that we covered in almost the past hour. We've been talking. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to try first the cultivated meat. I'm very curious. I really want to try it. Have you tried actually? Have you ever tried one?
I have. I mean, this is I think the most important, interesting thing to me, because as you mentioned, we were talking about consumers before. There's a lot of hesitation to try new foods. Like food
Mm,
neophobia is a thing. Like adventurousness is like a personality trait essentially when you go
yeah,
down to it.
that's
A lot of
true.
people aren't excited about trying new foods. But what's interesting with cultivated meat is when you taste it, and if you listen, I have tasted it, and if you listen to other people that talk about it, if you're putting chicken in your mouth, it's totally non, you know, exciting because it's just chicken, and you basically say like, oh, it tastes like it tastes like chicken,
It's
and
like
people are like,
chicken.
the producer's like, yeah, it's because it's chicken. And so it's at this at you know the same time it's amazing. It's like, how the hell did this, you can make this without having to kill an animal, but then at the same time it's so boring because it's just the meat that you're used to. But that is to say that I think tasting is believing with cultivated meat, and that's, I think, what's really sets it apart from other alternative proteins that we've seen struggle in the marketplace, like plant-based products, because really they don't compete yet on taste. And right now, plant-based products are still higher cost, and so essentially, as a consumer, you're paying more for something that tastes worse to you, and so your value proposition is
Yes.
just very, very lost. And so with cultivated meat, cost is the issue, but I think taste is going to be believing for the average consumer. And so I'm very excited to have these products work their way into the marketplace where more people can start to try them, and people can start telling their friends about how it tastes exactly like the thing that they thought they were eating, because it is the thing that they thought that they were eating.
Look, there is also that animal welfare and protection part that it is extremely important. I mean, you've seen those intensive feedlots. They are absolutely horrendous. But at the same time, I think about endangered species that could be basically saved by utilizing cultured meat techniques. Think about whales in Japan. That now that they're restarting to send the fleets out in the ocean to hunt for whales. If you're able to reproduce that as well, you can avoid that part. And we all know what kind of importance whales plays into the biodiversity and into the ecosystem balance. Anyway, this is, I think, a topic for an entire new episode of Raw Green. Thank you very much for being here, Elliot. I'll catch up soon with you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to chat about this.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Raw Green, brought to you by Obi, a sustainability consultancy firm specialized in life cycle assessment and decarbonization strategies. If you're looking to make an impact, a tangible and measurable one, reach out to us on our website at oneob.com or visit our social media. Links below in the description. See you at the next episode. Ciao.